Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. We're delighted to be able to host Bruce Schneier here with the Computer Science Department. I want to especially thank Ivan Martinovic, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, for his help coordinating this, as well as Sadie Kreis, Yarn Gall, and Michael Wooldridge. My name is Alan Defo. I'm the director for the Center for the Governance of AI at the Future of Humanity Institute. We think about the various risks and opportunities with AI and the policy opportunities for steering the world towards the opportunities and away from the risks. I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Bruce Schneier, who is an internationally renowned security technologist. He has a number of affiliations, a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, a board member of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Access Now, and the Tor Project. His blog, Schneier for Security, on security, is highly recommended, rich with insight, as well as his many books that come out on a regular basis. I see a number of audience members with their copies. So Bruce is working on some really important topics. His most recent book, Click Here to Kill Everyone, looks at the risks of having computers effectively everywhere connected, and especially connected to safety-critical systems, which is what Bruce will talk about today. After sharing his insights and recommendations, we actually are honored to have Gillian Hadfield here with us. She is a professor of law and strategic management at the University of Toronto, and she's also a senior policy advisor at OpenAI. And she will share some thoughts about how to innovate in governance. We will then have a bit of a conversation and then open the conversation to the room. So with that, please join me in welcoming Bruce Schneier.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. There are seats, people who are standing. I want to talk about the future, what I see as the future of security, especially how it affects the computer security industry. I think there are a lot of changes happening in our world that are important and we need to sort of understand and get ahead of. I want to start with a metaphor, and I want to start with the notion that everything is a computer. We are creating a world where everything is a computer. This is not a phone, right? This is a small portable computer that happens to make phone calls. And similarly, your refrigerator is a computer that keeps things cold. And your microwave oven is a computer that makes things hot. An ATM machine is a computer with money inside. A car is a computer with four wheels and an engine. I mean, this is true at all scales. It's true to the personal, and it's true for a power plant. These are all computers with things attached to them. This is more than the internet. Right? You'll hear this called the Internet of Things. I think even that is too narrow. It's the things, it's the internet, it's the data stores, the connectivity, the usage, it's everything together. Right? Our world is becoming increasingly computerized. And this means two things for our industry. It means that internet security becomes everything security, because everything's a computer. And it means that all of the lessons from our world become applicable to everything. So let me give 6 quick lessons from the world of computer security that'll soon become applicable to the real world everywhere. The first, software is poorly written and insecure. Right? You know this. Software is lousy. Basic reason is economic. We don't want to pay for quality software. With the exception of things like the space shuttle, we'd rather have fast, cheap, and feature-rich than good. We are all used to this. Now, right? Lousy software is full of bugs. Some of those bugs are vulnerabilities. Some of those vulnerabilities are exploitable. Some of those are exploited. Right? And we get a stream of patches all the time on all our software to deal with this. Not going away. Second lesson is that the internet was never designed with security in mind. Now, this is crazy when I say it today. But you go back to the early 1980s, 2 things are true about the internet. 1, it was never used for anything important ever. And 2, you had to be a member of a research institution to get access to it in the first place. And for those 2 reasons, the designers of the internet deliberately decided to ignore security. And the idea was, if your application needed it, you do it at the application level. And we are still living with the effects of that decision. The domain name system, internet routing, packet security, email addresses, on and on. We keep trying to retrofit security into the backbone, and it is hard, and we fail. Third lesson is extensibility. I'll say it as the extensibility of a computerized system means anything can be used against us. Now, extensibility is a property that we know in computer science the rest of the world is completely unaware of. Basically, what it means is you can't constrain the functionality of a software system because it's software. Right? When I was a kid, I had a telephone at home, big black thing attached to the wall with a cord. Great device, but now no matter how hard you tried, it couldn't be anything other than a telephone. That's what it did. Right? This, of course, is a computer that makes phone calls. It can do whatever you want. Remember Apple's first slogan? There's an app for that. This is extensible. You can add new software. It can do anything in a way that old telephone can't. Now, this means a couple of things for us. It means this system is continuously evolving, makes it much harder to secure. Right? It means it's harder to test. And it means this can be upgraded maliciously. When someone drops malware on my phone, it's just a feature upgrade. Feature I didn't want, didn't pay for, didn't ask for, don't know about. Right? But that's because this is extensible. We're living in a world where a modern internet-connected refrigerator can send spam in a way an old refrigerator can't because it's extensible. Right? Extensibility is moving to everything. Who's beeping? The fourth lesson is about complexity. The complexity of computerized systems means attack is easier than defense. Now, I've given hour-long talks on this, but basically, complex systems are harder to secure. Right? At every level, it is harder to secure this building than your home. Right? More complex, more access. It is just harder to secure a complex system. Internet is the most complex machine mankind has ever built, kind of by a lot, which makes it very hard to secure. Right? And we are not able to simplify in any meaningful way. Do stuff around the edges, but complexity seems to be where we are going. Right? So attack will be easier than defense for the foreseeable future. Fifth lesson is that there are new vulnerabilities as we interconnect. And as we connect things to each other, vulnerabilities in one thing affects other things. And we'll see this sort of again and again. Remember the Mirai botnet. In 2016, vulnerabilities in DVRs and CCTV cameras allowed hackers to create a botnet, drop a domain name service, and then drop a couple of dozen internet sites. 2013, Target Corporation, big cyber attack in the United States. Attackers got into the payments network through the internet connection of the HVAC contractor of several mid-Pennsylvania stores. Last year, article I saw is a Las Vegas casino successfully hacked through their internet-connected fish tank. Right? And vulnerabilities like this can be hard to fix sometimes because nobody is at fault. You could have two secure systems you put together and insecurity is created. There's one I blogged about a couple of years ago with PGP. And it's not PGP, it's PGP interacting with email systems. And you look at the vulnerability, and it's nobody's fault, yet here it appears. There's one involving Google, and the fact that Google email addresses don't use dots. Right? They ignore the dots, but some other systems don't ignore the dots. You can play that off to create insecurities. Who's at fault? We kind of don't know. And the last lesson is that attackers always get easier, better, and faster. And we see this. There's a never-ending increase in capability. And some of it's just the computers get faster. A password that was good 10 years ago might not be good today, not because we're better at password guessing, we're just faster at it. But sometimes we actually do get better. Right? Attackers adapt, figure out new attacks. And you see that in spam versus anti-spam, in ATM machine fraud versus ATM machine defense, more recently in deepfakes versus deepfake detection. Right? This attack versus defense, and attackers always get better. And expertise flows downhill. Right? What today is a top secret NSA program, tomorrow becomes someone's PhD thesis, the next day is a criminal hacker tool. And that's maybe 6 months. Right? Though that window shrinks. So we're constantly having to sort of re-up security. So none of this is new, right? I mean, I could have given that talk 5-10 years ago. What's changing is how we use computers, specifically automation, autonomy, and physical agency, right? What the computers are attached to. Right, so traditionally, we tend to be concerned about confidentiality. I mean, there's a CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those are the 3 properties that we provided as computer security people. But most of the time, when there's a security incident in the news, it is a confidentiality breach. Someone stole somebody's data. I think of Equifax, United States OPM, Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, all about data misuse, data theft. But the threats come in many forms. Right? DDoS attacks are an availability attack. Ransomware is an availability attack. Someone hacks a bank and manipulates the bank balances. That's a data integrity attack. But the thing about physically capable computers is that the integrity and availability threats are much worse than the confidentiality threats, because there's real risk to life and property. So, I'm concerned if someone hacks my hospital and steals my private patient medical records. That'd be bad. But it'd be much worse if they change my blood type. Right? It's a data integrity attack. And yes, I don't want someone to hack my car, turn on the Bluetooth microphone, eavesdrop on my conversations, but I really don't want them disabling the brakes. And that's a data availability attack. Right? So when you get computers that affect the world in a direct physical manner, integrity and availability are suddenly much more damaging. Think of cars, medical devices, drones, weapon systems, thermostats, toys, power plants, smart city, anything. I mean, we are going to see DDoS attacks against these critical systems. And we're going to see ransomware against cars. I mean, we can't imagine not seeing that. We just hope it doesn't happen at speed. Right? So the exact same attacks in this new world are much more critical. And this gets even more dangerous as our systems get more critical. So there's a 7th lesson, that computers fail differently. Right? We know how normal things fail. Like, let's take cars. Like, cars have parts have mean time between failures, and parts break, and there's a whole industry of auto repair in your community, in my community, that deals with this stream of cars that need repair. Computers don't fail that way. Computers all work perfectly until one day when none of them do. And that failure mechanism doesn't have a class break. We are used to, and the rest of the world isn't. And so if you stay at larger hotels, not the hotel I'm at here, but sort of big hotels in big cities, you'll often have keyless entry systems. And you wave a card in front of a reader and the door opens. A company that makes those, one of them is called Amity. And that is a computer that opens your door. And a few years ago, someone discovered a vulnerability in one of Amity's systems, allowed anybody to open any hotel room door. And the way you upgraded the Amity lock to remove that vulnerability is you manually went to each door and changed the firmware, right? Which means it didn't happen. Because hotels know how to handle the lock has failed. They probably have a locksmith on call, right, in the neighborhood, who comes in, brings his tools, fixes whatever, and leaves. And that happens once every other week. The hotel is not equipped for all of our hotel rooms in this building now have to be upgraded. And that is not a failure mode that they are used to. And so we're worried about things like crashing all the cars, shutting down all the power plants. And that's the way computer risks work. And so at the same time this is happening, some of our long-standing security systems are failing. I'm going to talk about 3 of them. The first one is patching. So our computers and phones are as secure as they are for 2 basic reasons. One is there's a team of security engineers at Apple, at Microsoft, at Google, who design these to be secure in the first place as best they can. And the second is the same team of engineers is on staff to quickly write and push down patches when vulnerabilities are discovered. We can't make this correct, so we're agile. And that works just fine. But that ecosystem doesn't exist in the world of low-cost embedded systems. Right? They're like home routers or DVRs. They're designed offshore by third parties. Ad hoc teams come together, write the code, disperse. The teams aren't on staff to write patches. Right? Even worse, a lot of devices cannot be patched. Like that Amity lock, like your DVR. Right now, the way you patch your home router is you throw it away and buy a new one. That's the patch mechanism. We don't have another. Now, honestly, throw it away and buy a new one is a pretty good system. And the fact that these things tend to have a 3-year or so usage life is good for security, bad for everything else. Because the new one you buy is going to be better designed, more secure. Right? So our phones, our computers, we tend to go through them pretty quickly. You move to embedded systems, and you don't have that churn. Right? You're going to buy a DVR every 10 years. You're probably going to buy, 2.5 refrigerators in the course of your life. And so you think of a car. Imagine a car. You buy a car today, software is 2 years old, drive it for, 10 years, sell it, somebody else buys it, they drive for 10 years, they sell it. Probably at this point, I think it's put in a boat, sent to somewhere in Africa, someone else buys it, drives another 10 to 20 years. Right, so here we are, right, 2019. So go find a computer from 1977. Try to boot it up, try to make it run, try to make it secure. We have no clue how to secure 40-year-old consumer software. We have a lot of trouble securing 40-year-old legacy industry software. Consumer, we have the faintest idea. Microsoft and Apple will obviate the depreciate operating systems, after 7 years? Because it's hard to maintain old software. But we're going to be expected to do that, not just in cars, in appliances, in toys. We are going to have an internet littered with insecure, unpatchable, legacy everything. And we don't know how to do that. Second thing that's starting to fail is authentication. Now, authentication really just barely works. Right? Passwords are lousy. Two-factor is good if you can use it. Biometrics have their own set of problems. We always have to have backup systems that are usually worse than the primaries. But the amount of authenticating we have to do is going to explode exponentially. So right now, when you authenticate, it's usually one of 2 things. You authenticate to a device. I just logged into my phone. When you authenticate to a remote service, I just checked my email. That's me authenticating to something. What we're going to see the rise of is thing-to-thing authentication. Right? The Internet of Things is the Internet of Things talking to each other behind your back. Right? For a bunch of good reasons. But you're going to be expected to have all sorts of things talking to each other. And if you have 100 IoT things in your person, that is 10,000 authentications. You have 1,000 things, that's 1,000,000 authentications. We don't know how to do that. We don't know how to do that at scale. We don't know how to do that ad hoc. And so imagine a driverless car. We'll have to, in real time, authenticate with thousands of other cars and road signs and traffic signals and emergency alerts. Right? Telling it stuff. What should I believe? That car over there says I'm turning left. Should I believe it or not? How do I know? Right? We have to do that immediately. And I've never met that car before, and I'll never see that car again. We don't have a good system for that. We have some, but they don't scale. Right now, When I go into my car, this device automatically authenticates with it and connects to its speakers. Bluetooth works just fine. Great. Thing-to-thing authentication without me being involved. But if you think about Bluetooth, I set it up. Right? I had to pair the two devices. And I'll do that, 25 times? I'm not going to do it 10,000 times. That's idiotic. I mean, how do we control these devices? Right now, if you have an IoT anything, you control it on your phone. Right? This is the IoT controller hub right here. You might sort of it ended up that way. But that's not going to scale to 1,000 devices. 25, 50 max. We don't have systems for that either. Third thing that's failing is supply chain. And actually, I claim this is an actually insurmountably hard problem. So in the news this year, last year, right, you read about supply chain. You've read about Huawei and ZTE. Should we trust Chinese-made networking equipment? 2 years ago, the debate was about Kaspersky. Should we trust Russian-made antivirus equipment? This is not just a US problem. In 2014, China banned Kaspersky. Actually also banned the US company Symantec. 2017, India banned a bunch of Chinese smartphone apps. I remember 2006, there was an encryption program developed by ISIS, Mujahideen Secrets, because you can't trust Western-made encryption programs. Even earlier than that, 1997, debate in the United States about Checkpoint. Can we trust an Israeli security company? But this is very much a minor piece of a much bigger problem. And where are the chips made? Where's the software written? This is not made in the United States. Its chips aren't fabbed in the United States. Its programmers carry 100 different passports. Any one of those can subvert the security of this. And we found backdoors in Juniper firewalls and D-Link routers. We found them try to be slipped into Linux. Last week, we read an article that Google found backdoors in Android that ended up in the master copy that was sent to phone manufacturers. We don't know how it got there, but it got there somehow. And there's a lot more to this. You have to trust the distribution mechanism. You have to trust the update mechanism. We've seen fake apps in the Google Play Store. NotPetya was distributed through a malicious update to a popular Ukrainian accounting package. You have to trust the shipping mechanism. There's a famous photo of NSA engineers opening a Cisco box and installing a backdoor intended for the Syrian telephone company. Any piece of the supply chain can subvert the entire supply chain. And if you remember last October, a big story that Bloomberg ran about backdoors in networking hardware, supposedly router boards that were destined for clouds, Apple's cloud, Amazon's cloud, Google's cloud, had a chip that was a backdoor. Bloomberg made a big story about this. It was denied by my government, your government, by Apple, by Amazon. Bloomberg doubled down. The story is correct. We have our reporting. It's months later. We actually still don't know the answer. Which I think demonstrates how hard this problem is. My guess is that story is not true because I would have seen a photo of this thing by now. But still, this is the problem. You have to trust everybody, yet you can't trust anybody. So in a lot of ways, this is a perfect storm. Right? Everything is failing just as things are becoming connected. And I think we've largely been okay with an unregulated tech space because fundamentally it didn't matter. And that's what's changing. And I think one of the things we have to understand is that law and tech have to work together. I think actually this is the most important lesson from Edward Snowden. We always knew that technology can subvert law. He showed us that law can subvert technology. And if both aren't working together, neither are working. So I just finished a book that speaks to this, mostly at a policy level. The title is Click Here to Kill Everybody, which is an awesome title. And I talk about a lot of different parts to this: standards, regulations, liabilities, international treaties and agreements. There's sort of ways to get from here to there. A lot of which I think are aspirational, but where we have to be. But I want to talk a bit about one potentially disruptive technology here that I think will change things in interesting ways, and that's artificial intelligence. That's AI. I think AI has the potential to upend pretty much everything we know about security. But the problem is we don't know how, we don't know what, we don't know when. Right? So I think of AI very much as a discontinuous technology. That there really isn't a stepwise path to the future. That things we think are easy turn out to be hard. Things we think are hard end up being easy. And those breakthroughs happen seemingly randomly. I think there's a lot to learn from AlphaGo. Right? When I was studying AI, I was taught that Go will never be solved by AI because it's just computationally infeasible. It blows up too fast. Until DeepMind says, oh yeah, we did that last month because we were bored. And they did. It turns out it's just a matter of throwing more computers at it, and not much more. And you know how AlphaGo worked, right? But they fed it every single human game of Go, and it learned strategy, and then it played itself a bunch of times and got really good. And then, of course, after AlphaGo, we had the AlphaZero project, which was the same as AlphaGo, so they didn't bother showing it any human games. And now AlphaZero beats AlphaGo pretty handily. And if you play Go, look at an AlphaZero game, because AlphaZero plays Go like an alien. It doesn't play like a human at all. And that's really interesting. So, right, so think about this kind of thing to computer security. We actually don't know what's going to happen. Right? We don't know how AI will affect the attack-defense balance, because unlike Go, the two sides aren't the same. They have different objectives. They do things in different ways. So we don't know what happens when attackers start using AI. We don't know what happens when defenders start using AI. Right? I mean, someone will have the upper hand. It's unlikely that it'll be even. But I don't think you can even begin to predict who will have the upper hand or how it will change over time. In the near term, I actually expect AI to affect the defenders, to improve the defenders more. Because attackers already have the upper hand. Right? Attackers can already pre-plan. They can already build adaptive systems. Being able to adapt as a defender at computer speeds is something we don't have yet, and that'll be a major improvement. Right? Being able to simulate attacks at computer speeds and learn from them will be a major improvement. And right now, we have an enormous cybersecurity skills gap. There are hundreds of thousands of unfilled jobs. If we can automate the lower half of those, we can have the humans do the hard human things. And that will improve security. And so I think near term, the defense benefits a lot. I think when you look at vulnerabilities, the defense benefits. So I think it's reasonable to assume in the near future that AIs will find all vulnerabilities in software. Right? Vulnerability finding is the kind of rote, hard, annoying, time-consuming task that feels really easy to outsource to computers. And it is just a matter of training them to look for vulnerabilities. Right? And so that, of course, helps the attacker and the defender, right? Because both use them. But when the defender finds a vulnerability, we patch it. So you sort of fast forward to a future, vulnerabilities get discovered in the development process. Right? Vulnerability finding by AI is like built into compilers. And suddenly, we could be here in 10 years and we can say, wow, remember back then when there were vulnerabilities and software were a thing? Wasn't that weird? Right? Before the AIs just fixed them all. Right? And that seems like it's going to happen. But then we have to worry about the legacy. Because remember, I also said that these things are going to stay around for years and decades. So you have almost this disjoint. Right? The AI start finding vulnerabilities. In the future, there aren't any. But all the ones in the past that we can't patch are now all obviously known to the attackers, and we have a lot of problem here. So that'll sort of be an interesting thing to watch. I mean, AI also affects the threat landscape, and a lot of people write about this, right? Malevolent AIs, killer robots, various catastrophic threats. I am actually less worried about those, actually for several reasons. I do believe that our fear of AI is really more of a mirror of our own society's fears than a harbinger of the future. I think like science fiction, it's really writing about the present projected into the future. And I think that is why I think AI fear is prominent right now. And AI, when you think of something in intelligent robotics, they're really a culmination of several precursor technologies. Right? They're a culmination of machine learning, of automation, of robotics. And the security risks from those technologies are already with us, right? Or they'll happen well before AI. Right? And they'll already increase as these technologies become more powerful and more prominent. So, I mean, I'm worried about intelligent driverless cars, but I'm actually also worried about unintelligent driverless cars, right? Or unintelligent drivered internet-connected cars. I mean, and I could certainly worry about robot soldiers, but modern-day autonomous weapon systems are also worrisome. And there's a quote I like from Rodney Brooks, the roboticist, and he was writing about this risk. And I'm going to read a few sentences. He writes, "Long before we see such machines arising, there will be somewhat less intelligent belligerent machines. Before that, there will be really grumpy machines. Before that, there will be quite annoying machines. And before them, the arrogant, unpleasant machines." I mean, there's going to be a path from here to there. And all the risks will be present throughout the path. And so I focus on solving the present day risks with an eye that they will help us solve the future risks. And I think that is the right way to focus. I don't need AI at all to worry about automation, autonomy, and physical agency. And they are dangerous on their own. So I want to talk about two principles. The first, one policy and one tech. The first policy one is defense has to dominate. That we need to decide once and for all that in the offense-defense balance, defense wins. Right? One world, one network, one answer. That we cannot build for surveillance and for security. And security is now much more important. And you'll see this debate in going dark. We saw this in cell phone security, in the border gateway protocol and traffic shaping, right? That we have to understand that defense has to win. Technically, I want us to build in resilience. Right? Assume in security and design systems that work anyway. Lots of ways to do this, and we sort of know the buzzwords: defense in depth, compartmentalization, avoiding single points of failure, ways to fail safe, removing functionality. Right? We're going to get security through some ways of achieving resilience, especially in the face of all these natural insecurities that we're going to have, whether they be in the network, in the devices. Right? How do I build systems that are secure on top of insecure parts? Very much like the internet. How do I build something reliable on top of unreliable parts? That's an engineering problem. It is solvable, and we need to solve it. The real question is how to get from here to there. And markets can't solve this. I mean, markets are short-term focused, markets are profit motivated, and these are externalities that transcend those. Right? These are collective action problems. And I think that government gets involved anyway. Right? The risks are too great and the stakes are too high. Government's already involved in physical systems like cars and planes and consumer goods. And the physical threat of an internet that can kill people will spur government into action. So I argue, and I'll say this when I go to Silicon Valley, which is very much anti-government, pro-libertarian, that our choice is no longer between government involvement and no government involvement, is between smart government involvement and stupid government involvement. And we need to start thinking about this now as engineers and techies, otherwise systems will be thrust upon us. And again, I don't see any alternative. There is no industry in the past century and a half that has improved safety or security without being forced to by the government. Cars, planes, pharmaceuticals, food production, medical devices, restaurants, consumer goods, workplace conditions, most recently in the United States, financial products. And if we want to make things safer, government is the tool we use. And it's not going to be the market. Market rewards make it as insecure as possible and get away with it. So with that, I'll stop, and there'll be other people talking, and then there'll be a conversation. So thank you.
All right, so I'm actually going to address exactly the point that Bruce ended up on, which was a bit pessimistic, or at least about the difference between governments and markets, saying there's no solution in markets, the solution is in governments. I've been thinking about this problem for quite a long time, and as many of you would sort of, if it's governments, we're in a bit of trouble because we know we're at the limits of what our existing governments can do. There we go. Can we? All right. So I've been thinking about this problem for a while. This is my book from a couple of years ago, and looking at the ways in which, for a lot of the kinds of problems that Bruce has been talking about, but saying what we can see today is that we have our regulatory systems, our legal systems that are not up to the task of managing the world we live in now. Our systems are too costly, they're too slow, they're too complex, and they're too local. So that one of the examples that Bruce emphasizes is supply chains. Why is that a problem? Because there's so much boundary hopping and jurisdictional hopping. It's very hard to come up with a solution when you got 30 or 40 countries involved in the production of products. So I've been thinking about this problem, and was asked to sort of very briefly talk about a solution that I'm working on. I propose it in the book. I'm now working with Jack Clark at OpenAI to put it forward more formally, and it's the concept of regulatory markets. So this is an innovation in our regulatory approach intended to help us get to the world where we can actually produce the regulation that accomplishes the kinds of objectives here. Because I will say that if you, what I find in these conversations with people in technology and AI and so on, there's this idea that the way we solve our problems with law is we decide what we want the world to look like. We write it down in some law and we get it passed by a legislature and boom, we're done. And most of the book is about how that doesn't work at all. It's too expensive. We don't get to that point. So this is a proposal for what we call regulatory markets. So, and I wanted to just take 10 minutes, right? I'm just looking at my time here. Okay, so this is a schematic picture of the way we think about regulation conventionally. We have governments, and then we've got our regulated entities. Those could be our providers of connected phones or cars at the bottom here. And governments, generally, this is in our schematic. They regulate primarily through command and control, saying, here's what you're allowed to do, here's what you're not allowed to do. The creation of those rules happens at the level of government, and it's then imposed on regulated entities. So the concept of regulatory markets is to change this picture in the following way. I want to insert a layer between governments and our regulated entities here, which I'm going to call this our private regulators. So these could be for-profit, not-for-profit companies, organizations that are in the business of developing regulatory systems, regulatory regimes. They could use regulatory technology like we have today, which is a set of rules, discursive rules written on text, monitored for violations, adjudicated for violations, and penalties imposed. But it could also involve regulatory technology that is, for example, the regulator of the self-driving car, for example, may say, okay, Bruce, if you have a self-driving car company, you have to allow me, your regulator, to monitor your data at all times. I might have complete access to the data. I may need the capacity to come in and monitor or modify parameters in the models, but that there could be regulatory technology different from our conventional regulatory technology. Now, what's important about this is the regulators in this model are competing in a market, but they are licensed by governments. They are licensed by governments based on their demonstration that they achieve outcomes that are set by governments. So what we're doing here is we're moving governments out of the job of coming up with the details of how we accomplish our objectives, like a reduced accident rate with cars or a reduced vulnerability rate to attack. Those outcomes are still set in our political layer, in our government layer, but then governments license private regulators according to their ability to demonstrate that they achieve those outcomes. And we say to all of our regulated entities down here, governments say to those regulated entities, you must choose a regulator from amongst the set of licensed regulators, but those licensed regulators now can compete for that business. And the point here about the competition is that they are getting paid by, so the regulated entities are purchasing, that's the dollar figures in here. They are purchasing their regulatory services from the private regulator. And the key thing here is that's creating an incentive for those regulated entity, those private regulators to innovate regulatory regimes, maintaining their license by maintaining their demonstration of their achievement of the outcomes set by governments. So the private regulators are dual facing. They're facing governments in the sense they must demonstrate the achievement of the outcomes, and they're facing the regulated entities in the sense of saying, I can do that better for you. I can provide you with a more reliable, less expensive way of achieving those outcomes. So this builds so many of you I know are thinking this is not regulation, this is self-regulation. It's not self-regulation, and it's building on what we are already seeing, the pressure from the limitations of government doing all of the detailed regulation. We're already seeing lots and lots of private participation in regulation, and it's existing private regulatory efforts. So what are the things? Standard setting bodies, the IEEE, ISO, for example, they are filling the vacuum of governments not coming in. So it might be that we say governments are saying, let's not regulate the drones. That might have been in your last talk. You mentioned that one, Bruce. But these international standard setting bodies are getting into the business of doing that. We see lots of the development of voluntary standards around AI safety, for example. We're seeing the development of those kinds of standards. Supply chain contracts, we do see regulatory structure in the supply chain contracts with the fires, for example, in the Bangladesh fires. We saw the introduction of lots of provisions in the supply chain contracts and other kinds of innovative organizations there to deal with that. We have ethical guidelines. We have certification schemes, food safety certification as an example. Private certification bodies, standards being set by government. So we have existing private regulatory efforts. So the model I'm proposing to you is not like completely out of the bounds. I gave you that schematic to begin with. It's really just the next step along the path we're already on. And it builds on existing new governance models. I gave you that schematic of command and control. There's already been lots of pressure in theory and regulatory theory moving away from command and control style regulation to outcomes-based regulation, management-based regulation, performance-based regulation. Let's see, we also can call it enforced self-regulation, meta-regulation. This is what the regulatory literature is about. Again, it's about, for example, instead of saying, here are the scrubbers you must install in your factories to reduce pollution, regulators saying, here are the targets you have to achieve in terms of emissions level. You, company, figure out how you'll achieve them. This is inserting a third-party regulator into that mix, okay, into that process. It's not self-regulation. These regulated entities are not writing the rules for themselves. They are choosing which regulator they will go with, but that regulator is required to demonstrate that it achieves the outcomes that are set by government. So it is not self-regulation. There's a third-party regulator. It's not industry self-regulation, which is, in fact, what we're seeing a real expansion in because of the limitations of government regulation. Because those regulators are regulated by government. Let's see. And it's not voluntary standard. It's enforced. It's required that there be a regulator chosen. So it's not all. Right now we're seeing, for example, in facial recognition, we're seeing Microsoft call for regulation of facial recognition. Google saying, no, we don't want self-regulation. We'll do it ourselves. This is not voluntary. It's mandatory to choose that regulator. And the key thing is that this is taking advantage of regulatory competition. Those of you who do anything, I don't know how many people we might have in the room who do regulatory theory. We're used to hearing conversations about regulatory competition, meaning the competition between states. for regulation, but this is in fact true regulatory competition. It's responsive to the capacity to create value there. And the key thing here is attracting investment, technical expertise, and innovation, because I'd like to emphasize the problem of regulatory innovation is as complex and as hard as the problem of building all that technology in the first place. And we can't solve those problems unless we can attract money and brains to those problems to keep up with the way in which we attract money and brains to building the technology itself. I think, oh, do you want me to stop? He only asked me to give this talk about 5 minutes ago, so.
At a natural point.
A natural point, okay. Have I got enough time to give an example of how this works? Okay, all right, here we go. Here's the example. So Jack and I talk about this in a paper we just did at iClear. So this, imagine you've got just a context. Adversarial attacks, we said, well, let's think about adversarial attacks on drone systems. Here's your various participants in the drone industry. So you got developers, you got manufacturers, you have companies that are using drone delivery services. They are all regulated entities. They are all told by government down here that they need to choose a regulator. And I've got one regulator here, but you want to think that there's multiple because we want competition between these regulators. So what are the regulators providing? So, there's research in adversarial attacks of different kinds of robustness techniques. So you might have a regulator that's developing those robustness techniques and requiring that they be implemented. They're conducting audits. They could be maintaining the test set against which models are being tested. So rather than having a test set within the organization that's developing the software, maybe the test set is held outside of the organization. They can be engaged in licensing. I know, Bruce, you've talked about the idea of, why do we not have as a requirement that people who are building these systems need to demonstrate that they understand basics about the way to design them. So we could have licensing of engineers, machine learning engineers here. I've got it in this context. So those are the services being provided by the private regulator to the entities. Regulated entities are sending money and data back to the regulator. That regulator is using that data, by the way, to build those systems, and it's mandatory. Now, government's down here, and I've got, it could be your conventional government, it could be international organizations, could be a government agency. They are developing the outcomes, principles, metrics. They're providing oversight and audits of the regulator. So government is moving into the role of regulating the regulator. And they are getting data and reports from that regulator. So there's a lot of advantages that come from that. Maybe I'll just leave that picture up there and stop, and then we can.
Let me ask a question about it. It's more complicated because that ecosystem in the upper right, each one of those entities might choose a different regulator.
They might, yes.
So it isn't necessarily one doing the whole industry. Amazon delivery chooses one, and drone manufacturer A chooses another.
Right, and so actually, I should do my next picture here.
Oh,
so
there you go.
there you go, exactly. Right, so it is, yeah, we've got multiple, and this is going to the supply chain problem because we have to solve the problem of global governance. And right now, all the pressure there is to say, well, Amazon or Uber or whatever would like a single regulator in all the markets in which it's operating. So that creates pressure for all governments to get on board, which is not going to happen. So here, it's actually what those entities actually can achieve here is if regulator 1 is approved by, let's say, all the markets in which a drone company wants to operate, then they can choose regulator 1. They can operate under the rules set by regulator 1, and they can have a single regulator for all the jurisdictions in which they operate. Exactly right. Another entity might choose to be regulated by regulator 2 and operate in the markets in which and multiple regulators approved by in any jurisdiction is what you're aiming for. One of the advantages here you get is you can actually have poorer governments free ride on the oversight of richer governments of the regulators. So Kenya can say, for example, any regulator of self-driving vehicles that's accepted by European countries, by North American countries, and so on, is also authorized to operate in our jurisdiction as well. Okay?